Hello everyone, and welcome to this episode of Talk and Development, the third in a series of talks with regional chief economists. The world economy is in a precarious position by a toxic trio of elevated debt levels, tighter financial conditions, and weak growth. Overlapping shocks from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, climate change, and the intensification of geopolitical tensions are weighing down growth. Today we're going to focus on the economic updates of regions, East Asia and the Pacific, as well as Europe and Central Asia. And we're going to learn how these regions are affected by these global trends and what is needed to turn to a long-term sustainable and inclusive growth trajectory. I'm delighted to be joined by Aditya Amattu, who is the chief economist of the East Asia and the Pacific region, and Ivailo Izvorsky, who is the chief economist for the Europe and Central Asia region. Aditya and Ivailo, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Talking Development. And Aditya, I'm going to start with you. You just released the update for East Asia and the Pacific region, and it's called Services for Growth, if I'm not mistaken. And I am very curious to learn. Your region has always seemed to outpace growth. When other regions go down, East Asia and Pacific is usually relatively strong. And I would be curious to see if you think that is still going to be the trend going forward, and why are services so important? Why are you emphasizing your report on services?
Anna, I think that positive trend and positive relative performance will be sustained. The good news is that the major economies in the region have recovered completely from the succession of shocks that you described. Output today in Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines is 10% higher than it was before the pandemic. In Vietnam and China, 20% higher. And the region is continuing to grow at about 4.5% or 5%. But it is a region that depends on exports. It's open to finance, and therefore the difficulties that you described of tightening financial conditions, slowing growth, have weighed on growth this year. It's going to be slower. Whereas the world improves next year, growth is expected to improve also in the region. But we do highlight three concerns. First, that is this pandemic legacy of debt, of households, of firms, of governments, which is affecting consumption and investment. The second is the fact that a lot of countries in the world are retreating from openness. We see trade and industrial policies which are protectionist. And finally, China, which matters a lot for the region and for the world, is slowing down. Now, some slowing down in China's growth was an unavoidable consequence of them moving away from a growth model based on investment in infrastructure and real estate and towards growth based on consumption and innovation. But they need to choose better policies, and they need to be more transparent and predictable. Otherwise, policy distortions and policy uncertainty will impose an additional growth cost on them. The big opportunity, as you identified, we see in services. This is a region that has thrived through openness to trade and investment in manufacturing, but still restricts entry and competition in transport, finance, communication, and a range of other services. And we show in this report that even the limited reform that's been implemented so far, as well as this digital revolution we are seeing, which is transforming services sectors, is increasing productivity, but not just in services, but also in the manufacturing sectors which use these services. So in a way, services reform is turning into very powerful industrial policy. And the beauty of it is that this combination of reform and digitization isn't just creating new opportunities. It's also, through better access to education, health, and finance, equipping people with the abilities and the capital needed to engage in this new digital economy. So that's why we argue in this report that deeper reform could generate this virtuous cycle between enhanced economic opportunity and greater human capacity.
Wonderful, thank you. Ivailo, let me turn to you. I think you just released your report like literally within the last hour or so. And of course, Europe and Central Asia is a region that has been so impacted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, by the increase and rising cost of living, and also by climate change. And of course, it's also a region that is highly impacted by the fact that winter is around the corner. And given the impact that we have seen over the last few years on commodities, on energy, on inflation, I was wondering if you could give us a sense of where does ECA go from here and how does it turn to growth?
So Anna, we just revised our growth projections for this year in ECA by about 1 percentage point. From 1.4% we expected in June to 2.4%.
This is good news.
This is good news. This is
because usually we were revising the other way.
We were revising the other way. And the good news is that despite these shocks that you presented, most of the economies of the region have been resilient. Despite the very high inflation in double digits, 16% on average late last year, despite these shocks, commodities, food and fuel prices, despite obviously the war that Russia is waging in Ukraine and is affecting everybody, I think these economies are growing and now we expect them to grow a bit more strongly. The less positive news is that this 2.4% growth, and the next several years we expect similar growth rates, of course provided the global economy doesn't pick up dramatically. But these growth rates compare with 5% growth the first decade of this century and 4.2% growth over the last 20 years before the pandemic. And so with such modest growth rates, it's very difficult for most countries to converge to high income. This is a big ambition for ECA. It's a full middle income region. Every country is a middle income country. But convergence is going to be very difficult, and especially for those that are far from the high income threshold. Now, within the region, and you know well, there's huge heterogeneity. The countries in the EU, we have the 4 clients in the EU, Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, Poland. The countries in the Western Balkans that trade a lot with the EU, depend a lot on trade, finance, linkages on people. So they're most affected by the slowdown in the growth in the Eurozone economy. I mean, we have projections or the consensus estimates are for growth being less than 1% in the Eurozone. With such low growth rates, our countries are not benefiting from the trade and investment they need to really pick up on growth. And then we have the countries in the East, those that depended a lot on remittances from Russia, trades with global markets with commodities. Some of them are benefiting from these exports of commodities. But during the first half of the year, when global commodity prices, especially for oil and natural gas, declined, their revenues also declined. And so their growth rates correspondingly declined. But they have a bit of a better prospect this year and next. We project growth rates that are, at least double what they are for the other part of ECA, largely because these commodity exports would continue to provide an impetus, and they also have, by and large, carried structural reforms to enhance competition, to reduce the role of the state, to make the economies a bit more transparent. Now, inflation remains a big issue. I mentioned it was almost 16% late last year, has come down in half, 8%, and despite the different inflation rates across the countries, 8% is way too high for comfort. It's much above what it used to be before the pandemic. For those countries that target inflation, it's 4 times as high as most inflation target rates. And so it hits households directly in their pockets. And as a result, because we have, especially for the countries in the western part of ECA, we have huge migration to the European Union, there, wages in nominal terms have to increase quite a lot to allow workers to be employed. And so we have this issue that while we have nominal wage increases that are very substantial, a lot of our countries do not have the business dynamism. You were talking earlier about East Asia. We are looking with envy at some of the countries of East Asia because we still don't have the business dynamism to support these, well-paying jobs.
So what I'm hearing from both of you is challenging times, uncertain times, opportunities that can still be tapped into, but they will require a pretty steady focus on making sure that policies are pursued that will create, you used the word I want to come back to, dynamism. And my second question for each of you, and you're going to answer in about 30 seconds because you're just going to mention one thing. What is the one policy you think policymakers in your respective regions need to focus on. One important one, I'm sure there are many, but one important one they need to focus on to create that dynamism so that the people of your respective regions can really aspire and rise up. Starting again with you, Aditya. One thing, 30 seconds.
Anna, if I may describe a small one bundle, because I think you need, first of all, I've said services is at the heart of this. Liberalization to get rid of the policy distortions. You need regulation to address the market distortions, the abuse of data or concentration. You also need public-private partnerships to create both the infrastructure and skills. And finally, you need international cooperation to deal with, for example, national concerns about privacy and cybersecurity without impeding the flow of data, which is the lifeblood of this new services economy.
This is very helpful in a nutshell. Policies and regulations. You need to make sure the public and the private interplay and we get the most out of it, and the international communities, which of course is so important, and also where we are right now in our evolution roadmap and what we're trying to do to really step up and play a part. Ivailo, same question to you.
If it's only one thing, I think it's education. The quality of education in most of our countries is not where it needs to be to create the jobs, the well-paying jobs, and to provide this dynamism that we desperately need in many of the countries. You look at PISA scores over the last 2 or 3 PISA tests, they have been coming down across most of the countries in the region. This is not right. Obviously now with the loss of learning during the COVID pandemic, very likely these negative trends are being exacerbated. So I think investing in better preschool education, primary, secondary, tertiary, everywhere we look, we have these good enrollment rates in most countries, poor results. And I think focusing on this is this sine qua non, without which we cannot get strong and sustainable and green growth.
Well, thank you so much, Aditya and Ivailo, for sharing your recent research and thoughts with us here today. And thanks to all of you for checking us out on this episode of Talking Development. Here is my take on the issue of growth. The global environment remains challenging, and while the context in East Asia and the Pacific and in Europe and Central Asia is very different, we know that policymakers can put the global economy back on track. In Europe and Central Asia, structural reforms such as improving market competition, reducing the role of the state, better governance of state-owned enterprises, and meaningful efforts towards the green transition, including the important role of education, have the potential to boost growth, enhance resilience, and support decarbonization. And in East Asia and the Pacific, the combination of services reform and digitalization can create new opportunities and enhance the capacity of people to take advantage of these opportunities. This is a great example of how policies are powering development in the region. Thank you so much, and see you again.